The winter of 1951-52 was of the most severe in years, with exceptionally heavy snowfalls, particularly isolating the residents of rural communities. The small village of Laggan, Nova Scotia, was no exception, particularly due to it being situated in the hilly McGrath Mountain district, some 20-odd miles from the thriving town of New Glasgow. The Laggan district is sparsely populated, mostly by native-born residents of Scotch and English descent, who, in their own way, live a quiet and easygoing life. Natives. Obtaining their livelihood from mixed farming and some lumbering operations, these people have been found to be sufficiently law-abiding as to require little attention from the police. Alexander Haggard, one of these quiet, unassuming individuals, in his early 60s, and a disability pensioner of World War I, owned and operated a small, well-kept farm some 5 miles from the main New Glasgow highway, and approximately 2 miles from the village of Laggan. He was well-spoken in the district until some 3 years ago, when he married former Agnes Bain following the death of his aged mother. He was considered a confirmed bachelor. His brother Duncan, a similarly easygoing type, also operated a small farm near the junction of the highway, some 4 or 5 miles from that of Alex Duncan Haggard's first wife. Died shortly after their son, Roy, was born. Though Haggard remarried, with several children being born, one of whom was Jimmy. At present 10, Roy, who lived most of the time with his uncle Alex, became very attached to him, and it was later revealed that, owing to this, he did not look too kindly on his uncle's marriage. Roy, none too well educated and somewhat of a shy, backward type, lived a quiet life with his uncle and aunt, and was considered a good, steady, reliable worker by those who employed him. As in the case of most residents of that heavily wooded district, Roy was the owner of a high-powered rifle and was considered an average shot. Duncan Haggard had not seen his brother for some time due to the inclement weather, and on Sunday morning, February 3rd, 1952, during the course of routine house chores, casually remarked that he thought he would hook up the horse and sleigh and go up and see Alex. One can well imagine his surprise when he was informed by his young son Jimmy, who had gone to visit his Aunt Agnes and Uncle Alex after school on Friday and had remained overnight, returning home with Roy around noon on Saturday, that he would find quite a mess, as Roy had shot Uncle Alex the day before and had dragged his body into the back porch. Without waiting to question the boy, Roy had left for New Glasgow the previous afternoon and had not returned to Duncan Haggard. Duncan Haggard lost no time in proceeding to his brother's place, accompanied by a neighbor whom picked up en route. No sign of human life was found at the farm, but they observed red stains in the snow just outside the rear porch and beside the well, beaten path from the house to the barn. The porch door was secured from the outside by a spike driven through a chain, and the front door was locked. A sleigh had been used recently, judging by the fresh tracks in the snow, and a freshly filled kerosene can stood beside it. Just inside the open barn door and partially over the threshold was a new bag of feed, which apparently had been broken open when it struck the floor. The restlessness of the stock in the barn indicated that they had not been fed recently. On eventually being able to peer through a portion of unfrosted glass in a small porch window, Duncan Haggard observed the body of his brother, clad in winter clothing, lying on his back on the floor at the far end of the porch next to the kitchen door. His cap and I don't know what that says. A carton of groceries were on the floor nearby. It was obvious to Duncan, from the battered condition of Alex's head and the pool of blood nearby, that his brother was dead. Without touching anything, he lost no time in notifying the RCMP at New Glasgow, who arrived a short time later and forced open the front door. It was evident that the dead man had been brutally beaten about the head and face. The nature of the wounds and a nearby red stained plowshare indicated the weapon used. A subsequent examination revealed a bullet wound entering the front of the neck just below the collar line and emerging around the middle of the back. It was obvious that Alexander Haggard had been dead for a considerable number of hours. A 38-55 rifle was leaning against the woodpile on the porch, and it was twisted and split stock and indicated that it had been used with some force as a club. The appearance of the head injuries coupled with the bloodstains and matted hair inside the cap suggested that the dead man had been struck on the head with a blunt instrument, possibly the rifle stock, prior to his cap falling off. What appeared to be a bullet hole through the glass in the window facing the porch from the kitchen was also observed. A search of the house failed to reveal any sign of Alex Haggard's wife, Agnes. However, partially cleaned up red stains on the floor in the kitchen and in the front hall stopped abruptly at the cellar hatch. Lifting the hatch door, the investigators found the body of Agnes Haggard, head first down in the cellway, with both ankles tied securely together with fence wire. As this victim's head had apparently wedged between two of the lower steps when dropped down the hatch, giving a decapitated-looking effect. When looking down from above, it had been necessary to bend the legs at the knees in order to close the trapdoor. It was impossible at this time to locate any wounds or injuries which may have caused death, but a subsequent examination revealed a severe skull-shattering wound in the vicinity of the right ear, apparently caused by a bullet fired through the kitchen window from the porch while Mrs. Haggard was peeling potatoes at the kitchen table. There was no evidence of a criminal assault. The senior member of the force at the scene placed a guard on the premises and lost no time in notifying the coroner and division headquarters. Members of headquarters, CIR or CIB or whatever it says, an identification branch, were dispatched to assist in the thorough and complete investigation of this one of the most brutal and gruesome double slayings ever to occur in the province. Subsequent inquiries revealed Jimmy Haggard to be the only eyewitness to the murder of his uncle Alex. And through the trials to follow, he came the Crown star witness. Although of tender years, his evidence was accepted under oath and given in flawless manner. Little did this boy know that it was the opinion of the investigators that he also was on the list of those to be disposed of along with his uncle and aunt. A brief summary of the story told by Jimmy following the discovery of the bodies of his aunt and uncle is as follows. On Friday afternoon, February 1st, 1952, on leaving school, Jimmy, a favorite of his Aunt Agnes and Uncle Alex, proceeded on foot through heavy snow to spend the weekend with them. That night, until 9:30, he played cards with his aunt, uncle, and Roy, following which they had lunch and had all retired in comparatively good spirits. Jimmy slept in a downstairs bedroom along with his uncle and aunt, and Roy in his own bedroom upstairs. On Saturday morning, Jimmy accompanied his uncle to the village store at Laggan via horse and sled. The elder, Haggard, had cashed in a $60 pension check the day before and was now en route to pay his monthly bill and replenish the larder for another month. Roy remained with his aunt to do the morning chores, and both were alleged to have been in good spirits. When Jimmy and his uncle left for the village, on returning to the farm, sometime toward noon, Jimmy observed his brother standing near the barn door, and when they drove over to the barn and commenced unhitching the horse and unloading the produce, Jimmy noticed that Roy was not wearing his overalls, as he had been earlier that morning. He also noticed what he thought to be the barrel of a rifle sticking out from under some hay on the barn floor near the door. Jimmy then took the carton of groceries from the sleigh and proceeded toward the house. He had just entered the porch and was about to approach the kitchen door when he heard what he took to be a shot. He placed the carton of groceries on the porch floor and returned to the outside porch door, where he saw Roy standing near the barn with a rifle, an aiming position, and pointed at his uncle Alex, who was walking from the open barn door toward Roy, as well as in the direction of the rear porch door with which Roy was standing partially in line. Another shot was then fired, and Jimmy observed his uncle lurch forward and stagger toward the house. He was followed by Roy, who, holding the gun by the barrel and swinging it over his head, struck him several blows on the head with the butt of the rifle. Alex Haggard continued to stagger, then fall, regained his feet, and continued toward the porch door, where Jimmy was standing, and collapsed in a heap just outside the door. Roy then commenced to drag his uncle into the porch, and by this time, Jimmy, terrified by Roy's actions, started for the road and home. After he had proceeded approximately 1 mile, Roy caught up with him. He was carrying a wallet containing a sum of money and bills and a key ring holding a number of keys, later identified as the property of Alexander Haggard, and had been removed from his person after the shooting. Roy then gave Jimmy $3 from the wallet and made him promise that he would not tell of the incident. Jimmy was not told, nor did he know what had become of his Aunt Agnes. On their arrival home shortly after noon, Roy and Jimmy chatted with their parents for some 5 or 10 minutes, and in reply to a question from their father as to how Agnes and Alex were, they replied, "Fine, Roy." Jimmy and the Jimmy and younger sister, Evelyn, then left the house and proceeded to the main highway, where they boarded a bus to New Glasgow. Arriving there about mid-afternoon, Jimmy and Evelyn accompanied Roy to a jewelry store where he had purchased a wristwatch. They then, after buying some candy and a few knickknacks, went to a show. Later, Roy met a boyfriend who was in the army and stationed at Halifax, but was home on the weekend. And in the presence of little Jimmy, they discussed the possibility of Roy joining the army. Roy then left Jimmy and Evelyn, telling them that he would see them later, and he went to the bus depot that evening to see them off for home. He told them that he would not be going home. That was the last Jimmy saw of Roy until after he was apprehended by the police in the following day. After hearing the story of the only eyewitness to part of the double tragedy, all police were alerted to be on the lookout for Roy Haggart, as well as his soldier friend, who was the last person to have been seen with him. As luck would have it, it was only a few hours later that Haggart was picked up by the police as he approached the New Glasgow Hotel, where he had registered the previous evening. It would seem appropriate to mention at this time that the soldier referred to was also located a short time later, and he advised that on accidentally meeting Roy on Saturday afternoon, the latter had spoken about wanting to join the army, and it had been arranged that he would accompany the soldiers to Halifax for that purpose. However, as Roy did not show up at the appointed meeting, placed the soldier merely on acquaintance, who had absolutely nothing to do with the murder, returned to Halifax alone. Roy told him nothing of the occurrences at Laggan that morning, and the soldier shattered when informed of the double tragedy. Shuddered. He recalled that it had only been 6 or 7 hours following the murders that he had accompanied Roy to a picture show, and that as they sat side by side in the dark, Haggart had nudged him with his elbow when a violent death occurred in the picture and remarked, "That's the way to do it." No struggle was encountered in apprehending Roy Haggart, and one would have thought he was merely being approached for routine questioning during the subsequent interrogation. He freely admitted the double killing and did not seem to be the least bit disturbed about it. As a matter of fact, after a complete statement had been obtained from him, his demeanor and general behavior warranted him being asked if he knew that what could happen to a person who had shot and killed 2 people. He replied, "A lot of things, I guess. They could even hang you for it," he casually remarked. That his aunt's nagging at him about turning on the radio and getting water in the morning, question after his uncle and half-brother had left for the village store, had caused him to shoot her. He had not, he stated, intended to shoot his uncle, and claimed that he had taken the rifle to the barn after killing his aunt for the purpose of shooting crows. However, when his uncle arrived home and allegedly made some remark to him about standing around rather than working, he had decided to similarly dispose of him. It was obvious from the interrogation that Roy, over a period of time, had built up a jealous hatred toward his aunt, showing no emotion in stating that he was not sorry for what he had done to her. Roy also admitted that following the incidents, he had taken all the money he could find in the house, as well as from his uncle's person. Considerable time was spent in collaborating the story, I don't know what that word is, by 10-year-old Jimmy Haggart. The storekeeper at Laggan recalled Alex and Jimmy leaving his establishment around 11 a.m. Saturday, February 2nd, and among the provisions found in the carton of groceries left on the porch by Jimmy, when he heard that first shot, were chocolate bars and scribblers for the youngster who was previously stated was the favorite of his aunt and uncle. 2 expended .38-55 shells were found in the vicinity of where Jimmy had seen Roy standing when the shots were fired. Another used shell was also found in another portion of the yard near the house. Where Roy had thrown it while en route to the barn after shooting his aunt. And as it appeared that Roy had fired 2 shots at his uncle, the first shot apparently missing him, a search in the direction in which he was firing revealed a seared fence post some distance away, from which bark during the seat had been freshly torn. The overalls which Roy had been wearing when his uncle and half-brother left for the village store, but which Jimmy had observed Roy was not wearing when they returned to the farm, were located on the stairway in the farmhouse in a manner indicating they had been thrown there in somewhat of a hurry. 1 live round of .38-55 ammunition was found in the overall pocket, as well as a pocketbook containing the identification card bearing the name Roy Haggart. A box of .38-55 shells was found in Roy Haggart's bedroom, with 4 missing, and these were accounted for in the recovery of 3 expended and 1 live round. The provincial pathologist performed autopsies on the bodies and victims were able to state that both had been dead for a considerable number of hours prior to their discovery, and that both had died as a result of bullet wounds, with extreme violence having been administered to Alexander Haggart prior to death. He also identified stains on the overalls as being blood of human tissue, origin, and found human blood on plowshare, and described some of the head and face wounds of Alexander Haggart as being consistent with having been inflicted by various vicious blows with a similar type of instrument. Little Jimmy's story was further corroborated by several residents of the district who had met and spoken with Roy and Jimmy en route to the latter's home after the shooting of Alexander Haggart. It is of interest to note that the closest neighborhood to the Alexander Haggart farm is 3/4 of a mile away, and no one was located other than Jimmy, who had heard any of the shots fired on the morning in question. The investigation was able to show that the money spent by Roy Haggart after the shootings compared favorably in amount with what Alexander Haggart should have had on his person after paying the bills and so forth from the $60 pension check he had received and cashed on February 1st. In addition, Duncan Haggart identified the .38-55 rifle as one he formerly owned, but which he had sold to his son Roy approximately the previous year. A search of the hotel room occupied by Roy Haggart on the Saturday night also revealed a pair of blood-stained leather mittens, identified as belonging to Roy, and the wire twisted around the ankles of Agnes Haggart, and apparently used to drag her body from the kitchen to the cellar hatchway, was found to be identical to, and in all probability removed from, a coil of similar wire found in the yard of the Haggart farm. An experiment showed that the hole in the kitchen window resulted from a bullet being fired from the porch into the kitchen while Agnes Haggart stood at the kitchen table facing the porch, the bullet striking her in the right ear and disintegrated inside the skull. Miss Haggard's broken glasses were on the kitchen floor, and a portion of the right ear stem was found embedded in the brain. And although she was only wearing one shoe, when the body was found, the other shoe was on the floor alongside the kitchen table and apparently in position at which she was standing when struck by the bullet. 2 charges of murder were preferred against Roy Haggard, and following the preliminary hearing before Provincial at New Glasgow, Nova Scotia on February 21st, the accused was committed for trial on both charges. As the date for trial drew near, an insanity issue was raised by defense counsel, and having been informed that the defense proposed to have Haggard examined by psychiatrists, the Crown also appointed a psychiatrist to examine him. Both subsequently submitted reports stating that their opinion the accused could be classed as low-grade moron with a mental age of approximately 8 years, and thus was unfit to stand trial. The accused went to trial before Justice W.L. Hall in the jury picked out, Nova Scotia, on May 19th. On the charge of murdering his uncle, defense counsel did not raise the insanity issue until after the petty jury had been impaneled, thus leaving no alternative other than, should the accused be found fit to stand trial, the same petty jury would try the accused on the charge of murder. Had the insanity issue been raised prior to the selection of the petty jury, and then the accused found to fit to stand trial. A new jury would have been selected to try the murder charge. It was evident here that defense counsel strategy is being able to object or set aside certain jurymen, which opportunity they would not have had if the insanity issue had been raised prior to the impaneling of the jury, was with the hope that the accused would have undoubtedly been found unfit to stand trial. Defense counsel called the 2 psychiatrists, both of whom mentioned earlier, classed the accused low-grade moron with a mental age of 8 years. However, under cross-examination, both admitted they felt that the accused knew what was going on, and that he was on trial for murder of his uncle, and that he could, in their opinion, follow the proceedings in a general way. A rather amusing feature was brought to light during the cross-examination of one of the psychiatrists. While the witness was revealing the procedure and examination given the accused in establishing his mental age, it was found that the youth had been given 1 mark too many. He had been marked correct on a question that was in part incorrect, thus again lowering his mental age slightly. As it was the Crown's contention that the examination, questions and answers, given the accused was not suitable to a person brought up in the environment of the backwoods, this error created an embarrassing situation which the Crown took advantage of by endeavoring to establish that the accused was asked a number of questions, one of which the witness psychiatrist could not himself answer correctly. This incident, it might be mentioned, was given considerable newspaper publicity. After the Crown called a number of witnesses who were acquitted with the accused, and who, although considering him somewhat backward and shy, found him to be rather normal in his actions, the petty jury, after 20 minutes deliberation, found the accused fit to stand trial. Some 20-odd Crown witnesses were called in ensuing trial in view of the results of the action taken by the defense in previously raising the insanity issue with regard to the fitness of the accused to stand trial. The defense did not raise the issue of his insanity at the time of committing the crime. However, the judge, in his address to the jury, informed them that the accused could be found not guilty on such grounds. In the early morning of May 21st, after 5 hours deliberation, the jury found the accused guilty of murder as charged, and His Honor subsequently sentenced the accused to death by hanging. The penalty to be carried out on August 14th. On August 6th, after due representation had been made through the Secretary of State, Haggart's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Although the second charge of murder was reversed to the next term of the court, it is doubtful, in view of the results of the first charge, that this case will be proceeded with. It would seem doubtful that one could imagine the trying ordeal that little 10-year-old Jimmy Haggart must have gone through from the time of witnessing the shooting and the brutal beating of his uncle to the conclusion of his half-brother's trial for murder. This boy is the only eyewitness, gave evidence that was accepted under oath on more than one occasion during the several court proceedings. As previously stated, Jimmy Haggart was a favorite of his late aunt and uncle, and it is felt that his visit to the farm on that fateful weekend, and uncle taking him to the village on Saturday morning in place of Roy, built up the latter's jealous rage, which apparently had been smoldering with him for some time to the pitch required to commit the killings. Thus, it is in the opinion that the investigating members that when Roy went out to the barn after disposing of his aunt and apparently lie in wait for his uncle's return, one of 2 shells he took with him, third was left over in his overall pocket, could have been for the purpose of silencing Jimmy, who would be the only eyewitness to the actions. If so, fortunately, Roy was requited to fire 2 shots at his uncle before striking him, and thus, in all probability, 1 life was saved. It is to be hoped that Jimmy Haggart's tender years will assist in erasing this horrible experience from his mind during the years to come. One would usually expect to find an obvious motive for so brutal and gruesome a crime as described herein, or that it had been committed by a cold-blooded killer, or a completely mentally deficient maniac. However, in this case, although the investigation revealed robbery to have occurred and slayings of the 2 victims, but which it is felt was an afterthought by the accused, one finds none of the expected motives or type of individual responsible. The accused in this case is well-built, good-looking, quiet-spoken youth of limited education, who had spent most of his life in rural community of the province. The motive of, as opened by the investigating members, strikes somewhat of a sympathetic note, regardless of the fact that the actions of the accused were of a most brutal nature, with his mind apparently having developed into that of the worst criminal type. Roy Haggart was one of those unfortunate who went through the most of his 18 years without that part of a home environment, which is considered most necessary. Mother's attention. Thus, as was found, he became extremely attached to his uncle, Alex, with whom he lived and who was, as much as possible, took the place of a mother. However, when his uncle, although somewhat late in life, decided against a further bachelorhood existence and took unto himself a wife, the attention previously shown Roy lessened somewhat, and although his newfound aunt Agnes was considered to have been good to him in an average strict sort of way, she apparently did not look upon him in the light of one near and dear to her as a mother would look upon a son. It was gathered that she occasionally criticized her husband for giving too freely to Roy, particularly in the way of money, as he had done prior to the marriage. Thus, in jealous hatred, began to build up inside Roy toward his aunt and smoldered over over the several years of his uncle's marriage, with the climax coming suddenly one fateful weekend. While this theory by no means accounts motive for the subsequent murder of his uncle, to whom he was so attached, it is felt that it was as Roy's mind reacted, his way of preventing his uncle from learning what he had done to his Aunt Agnes, thus accounting for the vicious attack on his uncle as he headed toward the house after Roy had shot him. In conclusion, and possibly of interest to those engaged in the enforcement of law and order, it will be noted that it is considered an opinion of those participating in this investigation that the accused used starvation for companionship and affection, which he was not normally afforded, together with his lack of education, caused his mind to warp to the extent that he committed and was convicted of a most unnecessary and hideous crime. Thus, one might well consider it encouraging the various youth programs undertaken today by different law enforcement agencies, as such activities, while not necessarily a preventative against this particular type of crime, may be preventative against a crime, but by the type of an individual whose mind becomes similarly warped through lack of companionship and affection, with the policeman being the target. I thought I seen deer tracks, didn't I, somewhere?